let's see, I haven't really done a, the sharing on the phone is not so simple. I'm gonna have to learn how to do that maybe. I'm trying to see if I can do it through my laptop still. It might pop up the laptop, in which case I'll switch at some point from the phone to the laptop. But okay, as I say, I've been in England for 3 weeks. It's the longest I've been there for a little while. We went, Baruch Hashem, for a family simcha, for the bar mitzvah of a grandson, and spent a bit of time with our children and grandchildren in England. And bring you all best regards from Britain. And of course, the great sadness of losing the final, the football final, that was really one of the great low points of our visit. Not that it's really something that I enormously concerned about, but it was certainly the whole country really came to a halt for a little while. Now let's see. Could be. I could be. Okay. I'm going to try and exit my phone.
So Rabbi Kimche is trying to get on through his laptop now, where he can share.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes? Yes? Yes, good, lovely. Thank you very much. My apologies for all the IT complications. But I think we're doing all right. And I'm going to try and share the text. Okay, let's get back to our little learning quiz that we have here together. And we're looking at one of the most remarkable and mysterious episodes in the entire book of Bereshis, maybe in the entire Chumash. The events surrounding Gan Eden, Adam and Chava, the Eitz Hadas, and the subsequent consequences of having eaten from the forbidden fruit and being expelled from Gan Eden. That whole parsha is, on the one hand, seemingly belongs to, in a sense, the prehistory of Klal Yisrael. It's not really the history of Klal Yisrael. It's something which is prehistoric. In other words, events that took place in the real origins of mankind. But the Torah gives us these stories to tell us something about the original nature of mankind and the way in which human beings are, if you like, connected to, on the one hand, connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on the other hand, have a tendency to disconnect from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, the life in Gan Eden was a life, the life of Gan Eden is hard for us to describe exactly, but it certainly was a life of idyllic harmony. Harmony in the sense that the human beings were created in harmony with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with nature, and with each other. 3 different levels of harmony. The Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, if you like, the Bein Adam L'Mokoim, and the Bein Adam L'Adama, right? The connection with nature itself. Once they had eaten from the forbidden fruit and they had committed the Aveira, that harmony was compromised. I'm going to show you a few interesting sources today to show you a few things. First of all, it's interesting in the writings of Chazal, an attempt to minimize the if you like, the culpability of Adam and Chava in this Aveira. And I mentioned to you before, but it's worth mentioning again. In this respect, Judaism and Christianity take very divergent views about this story. In the Christian understanding of Adam and Eve in Gan Eden, this was a moment where mankind became the fall of man, with a capital F, the fall of man, from which he never recovered, and from which he can't recover, and which in a sense created a damnation within human beings. And human beings at that point were lost, and they could only regain their connection to God through a savior of some sort who would come along, and that is the foundational myth of Christianity, that they needed a savior in order to reconnect them to God after this chait. In actual fact, Chazal do not see it that way at all, and that there was definitely a chait of some sort. There definitely was an Aveira. But as we will see, it is considered to be something which was done inadvertently, a b'shogeg. In fact, you might be aware of the fact that the word chait itself, chet tet aleph, right? Chotosi, chotanu, when we say al chait shechotanu, the word chait implies that it was done unwittingly, that it was done in some way without intent, right? In Hebrew, we have three words referring to a person committing a sin, right? There's chotosi, ovisi, poshati. So the ovon and the pesha are more premeditated and more acts of rebellion and rejection of God. But the chait is the least of all the levels of intentionality in Averis. In fact, it's interesting in Hebrew itself. Does anyone know? I'm opening this to everybody. Anybody can suggest something. What really is the origin of the word chet? Chet tet aleph. Does anybody know? Anybody want to have in and it's used like this in modern Hebrew as well. Any offers on chet, the word chet? I'm afraid you're going to have to unmute yourself in order to make a contribution to the shir. You can unmute yourself by pressing your space bar while you're talking.
It's a derivation from cleaning.
Okay, you're quite right. There is a connection to chitui, which means to clean. That's true. But that, in a sense, implies, if you like, the remedy of it. It's something which can be cleaned. It's not something which leaves an indelible mark. It's in that sense cleanable, right? That's the point of the word chet. Has anybody got any other offers on the word chet? Chet tet aleph?
To miss the target.
Yes. In modern Hebrew as well, if a soldier is doing a rifle practice and he shoots and misses the target, the word to miss the target is lahachati et hamatara. Chet tet aleph means you've missed the target. So in actual fact, the chet, the implication of the word chet is there was a target, meaning there was an opportunity to connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you missed it. And by missing the target, that's the chet. But it's through lack of attention, a lack of focus that it happened. And I'm going to have a look at a few sources now, just to show you the Mefarshim on the chet Adam Harishon. Definitely try to minimize the amount of it. At the same time, it's true that in the more mystical tradition, in the writings of the Zohar and the Arizal, there you do have definitely the idea that at the Chet Adam Harishon, something spiritual in the world was shattered, was destroyed, and that in a sense the whole of human history, spiritually speaking, ever since has been to remedy that disaster, and that's really the meaning of the word tikkun ha'olam. Tikkun ha'olam means to in some way repair the world, repair a shattered world, and this is language taken from a Kabbalistic literature that sees the Chet Adam Rishon as the beginning of the shattering of the spiritual purity of this world. Let's have a look at a few sources together, ladies and gentlemen. So let's see now if I can get. Oh dear. Second, bear with me. Let's try that again. Okay, how are we doing? Can you see a text? Yes, Ellie, thank you. Okay, so we've now got a text up. Hope I can make it work. Okay. So, okay, so this is the pasuk we finished with last time, at the end of the shir last time, that Adam is asked by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what have you done, right? And he says he blames it on his, and he blames it on Chava, he blames it on his wife, and in that sense, I mentioned last time, it was a failure of taking responsibility. But let's have a closer look at this pasuk for a second. So he says, Ha'isha, the woman, and then he says these interesting words, Asher nosata imodi, that you gave me, right? Now the truth is, this whole sentence would have made equal sense without those three words. The pasuk could have read, Vayoma Adam, Ha'isha hi nosna li min ha'etz va'ocha, right? Or even without four words, right? The pasuk would have made sense. It's always an interesting exercise when you're looking at the Chumash to see which words, in a sense, are superfluous. The pasuk could have read Vayoma ha'isha, Vayoma ha'adam, ha'isha nosna li min ha'etz va'ocha. And yet, he says, Asher nosato imodi, that you gave her to me. So so there are a few perushim here which I wanted to share with you for a minute. We've looked at a few here. This is the Vilna Gaon on this pasuk. He nosnoli. So the Vilna Gaon writes like this, which I find quite interesting. The Vilna Gaon's comment. Ato tzivisonu shelo ocha mimenu. Right? When you commanded me not to eat from it, shelo etlo shapri biyodi. I thought that the Aveira was detaching the fruit from the tree. In other words, there was nothing about this mitzvah that Adam understood. He didn't understand why it was bad or what was wrong with it. So he thought that the problem was that he's not allowed to go to this tree and detach the fruit. But the acha shehi nosnoli, that since she gave me a detached piece of fruit, I thought that it was permitted for me to eat it. Because you told me I shouldn't eat from it. So the Vilna Gaon wants to give, if you like, into the mouth of Adam some sort of, if you like, counsel for defense. He's trying to minimize what Adam has done. And he says, I thought that the Aveira was I shouldn't go to this tree and help myself. That if something fell off the tree or somebody came and gave it to me, I thought that wasn't a problem at all. And he comes to the word mimenu. Says the Vilna Gaon, mimenu, the word mimenu, miyutar, is superfluous. I thought that the problem was that I wasn't allowed to in some way damage the tree, that by removing its fruit, I was damaging this tree. All other fruit trees, they were trees which I was allowed to, in a sense, help myself, even if it meant damaging the tree, in other words, removing something from the tree, and this tree had to remain complete and pure. That's what I thought. In other words, so the Vilna Gaon is trying to give Adam, trying to look more closely at the words that Adam uses, and he focuses on the word he nosnoli. She gave it to me, and because she gave it to me, I thought there was nothing wrong with it, right? And then he goes on to say, Dalad Aleph always means Dover Acher, another interpretation of the Vilna Gaon. He nosnoli min ha'etz. She gave me fruit of a tree. And look at this. The lo yodati eze etzu. And I had no idea from which tree this fruit came. In other words, what she gave me was a detached piece of fruit for breakfast, right? And I had no idea that it came from the Eitz Hadas, lochein v'ochal, and that's why I ate it. I want you to pay attention here. I find this quite interesting, that someone like the Vilna Gaon is actually attempting to, in a sense, defend Adam and show that actually the whole chait was inadvertent, was something which was not done as an act of rebellion against God or rejection of God's word, but it was something done unwittingly, right? And therefore, Adam, in that sense, is to a certain degree exonerated. The Ramban takes it even one stage further, and he says, why does Adam add the words, this is the woman you gave me? You gave me this woman as my help in life. And therefore, I thought that everything that she gave me was positive. I think we touched on this Ramban last week already. So you see here some very interesting, and the Orach Chaim as well. Venire says shekavanas ha'odam shelo yoda dovo, that he had no idea what it was that he was eating. Ki imo isha hevia lefonov hamazuman. She gave him something which was ready to eat, right? He had no idea where it came from. V'ocha ve'eino chayev lishol al mugash lefonov dovo ze minayin. He's not obligated, he thought he was not obligated to ask on every item of food, where does this come from? He was living in a world filled with all sorts of foods which HaKadosh Baruch Hu had given. Okay, so basically, I think this is, and then just to emphasize it, I think this is the main point I wanted to make here in the beginning of the Shia. Can you see that? That the sin of Adam Arishon was by mistake. But Efsha didn't own Es Yeshla, and maybe even less than Shogeg, less than inadvertently, maybe it was something completely beyond his control. Okay. So this is Adam. When it comes to Chava, it's not so simple. Her defense is more complicated because she did know where she was taking the fruit from, and she does take from the Eitz Hadas, but she says her defense is Vayom Hashem Elokim leisha mazos chasisa v'atomen. So what does she say in her defense? The serpent, the snake, he fooled me. How does he translate it here? He duped me. and I ate. In other words, her defense was that the power of the snake was too strong for her to resist. She was unable to resist it. And in that sense, and as we've spoken about before, this snake is not some sort of not necessarily some sort of animal in Gan Eden. This snake represents the power of temptation, the power of the Yetzer Hara, the power that really she succumbed to to her own desires. And in a sense, what she's saying is, look, you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, created us in such a way that you've given us a power of temptation which I was not able to overcome. Okay, what happens now is that in this sense, what's interesting about this whole story is, in a sense, that the Torah gives us a beginning of mankind living in an idyllic world, and for some reason mistakes are made. And as we say now, if we follow this line of thought, that both Adam and Chava, in a sense, were not willingly rebelling against God. They weren't willingly doing something premeditated as an Aveira, and they lost that state of purity. But the Torah wants to give us this idea that the human beings began their existence in a spiritually pure state of harmony. The idea of Gan Eden is deeply rooted in the Torah, as in a sense a pure origin that later on gets polluted by various mistakes and errors and problems along the way. And the idea behind this is exactly in order that a human being should understand that there is a level of purity that one can revert to. In other words, the original state of mankind is not a state of confusion and of being compelled to do bad things. The original state of the human being is one of spiritual purity, and that in actual fact, the goal of mankind is in some way to revert back to that original state. So this idea is very deeply rooted in the Torah and in Chazal. So in a sense, I would say that the Torah perspective, the perspective of Chazal on the Chet Adam Harishon, in a sense, is the exact antithesis of the Christian understanding of it. Christian understanding of it was that sin actually damned mankind forever, right? Whereas the Torah point of view is quite the contrary. That sin actually showed that really mankind is able to live in a world of spiritual purity and of spiritual, if you like, and moral harmony, right? Things have happened in the meantime which have disturbed it, but one can recapture it. It's possible to recapture and to find one's way back. And I'll show you in a minute in the Pasuk, it's very interesting that even though they are thrown out of Gan Eden, Adam and Chava, as we all know, were expelled from Gan Eden, nevertheless, the Pasuk says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu appointed a malach, right, at the exit of Gan Eden. So it says lishmor as derech eitz hachayim. So sometimes it's translated to mean to make sure they wouldn't go back in again to Gan Eden. But many of the Mefarshim point out that if you look carefully at the text, it means exactly the opposite. That there's a malach at the entrance to Gan Eden to make sure, lishmor means to make sure that they can find their way back in again. That it is possible to find one's way back in again to Gan Eden through the power of mitzvahs, through the power of a spiritual life, that one can regain the levels of Gan Eden. Gan Eden is not lost forever. It was there initially, it was lost, but it was lost only in order to be regained through the efforts of mankind. And we'll see that in the Psukim shortly. Let's go on here for a moment. I'm not going to spend too much time on the snake. I'll leave that for the moment. But I want to have a look for a moment at what is the curse? What is the punishment? Second. Sorry, just one second. I'm just flicking through here, trying to remember which texts I put here. Right. So what is the punishment that Chava gets? Right. So here the pasuk says, "Velo isha omar." So God says to Chava, "Harba arbe itzvoneich v'heironeich be'etzev teldi bonim ve'ishech chukosech v'hu yimshol boch." Now this is a very severe statement made to Chava, and really there are three things being said here. Ela isha ama harba arba itzvoneich, right? The itzvoneich v'heironech be'etzev teldi bonim. So basically, this is a reference to childbirth. The idea is that originally childbirth was not meant to be either painful or dangerous, and that in the Gan Eden state, the woman is able to give birth to a child without any pain and without any danger to her life, right? So the first curse really is that from now on, the activity of giving birth to children will be painful and dangerous, right? I will make you severe your pangs in childbearing, their children, right? The second curse is vel isheich teshu koseich v'hu yimshol boch. That even though you know of the great pains of childbirth and right, nevertheless you will have a strong desire to get together with your husband and have children. V'hu yimshol boch. And there's a very interesting theme here about the subservience of Chava to Adam. The subservience to yimshol boch, he will rule over you, right? Now what's interesting here is, I'd like to just make an interesting a point of both Jewish history, but certainly world history. I think everybody knows that in world history, the status of women throughout history until about 100 years ago was totally subservient and totally secondary in every possible way. In other words, it's almost impossible for us to understand this nowadays with our 21st century mindset, or even a 20th century mindset. But if you read some of the material, as I have done, you know, some of the public debates that went on in England and America, in civilized countries throughout the world, even just 100 years ago, when there was an initiative that women should get the vote, for example, that women should get the vote, or that women should be allowed into university, right? And the outcry was unbelievable, right? If you can read the debates that took place in the British Parliament, right, around the beginning of the 20th century. It's not a long time ago, only about 120 years ago, about the idea that women should get the vote. And really, you know, civilized, intelligent people said, what do you mean giving the vote to women? Women understand nothing. Women, you might as well give the vote to monkeys, right? This is the way people spoke. Intelligent leadership people in civilized countries had no idea, still 120 years ago, right, that it was possible for women to live on par with men at all levels. So what's interesting is that this thing that was said, but if you look carefully at this pasuk, it's interesting to see that the Torah gives us this whole idea of women being subservient to men and not having the same status. The Torah doesn't give it to us as part of the nature of Adam and Chava, how they were created in the beginning. On the contrary, when in the beginning, when Adam and Chava are created, the pasuk says that they were created equal. They were created with Tzelem Elokim, a Zachar u'Nekeva Bora Osam. He created the man and woman, and the Torah doesn't relate at all to the idea of the subservience of a woman being built in to the nature of man and woman, not at all. However, the idea of the subservience of the woman to the man comes about as a result of the curse, as a result of the disaster after the Chet Adam Harishon, after having eaten from the forbidden fruit. In other words, it's not built in to the nature of a man and woman. It's part of the deterioration of man and woman, that she is subservient to him, and that this is something which is very, very fascinating. I'll tell you why it's particularly fascinating, and that is that we find in the mystical tradition, in the writings of the Zohar, there is this idea that the world is going through, if you like, a process of tikkun ha'olam, that every generation adds a certain layer of, in some way, remedying the original sin and the original spiritual defects of the world. And as that happens, the effects of the original curse become less and less. In other words, there is a prediction, it's a very interesting thing. In the Zohar, there is a prediction, right, that this idea of, for example, the subservience of women will indeed, as one gets closer to the time of Mashiach, will indeed become less and less significant and less powerful within mankind. So we are living today in a world where actually that concept of the subservience of women has really disappeared completely out of the mind, certainly in the Western world. I won't say in the Arab world, it's still very much the case, the subservience of women. I don't know what's going to be now in Afghanistan. They're speaking about Afghanistan after the British and American troops leave, the Taliban take over. The people who will suffer most from the Taliban regaining control of Afghanistan is the women, because in their culture, the women have got no rights, no education, no career, and no way to defend themselves, even in law or in any way, against all sorts of difficulties. And they're not allowed to travel unchaperoned. They're not allowed to drive cars. They're not allowed to do anything which in any way asserts their independence, right? Because you see in the Arab world, you still see very much the subservient role of women in society. In the Western world, it's only in the last century. It's only in the last century that women have the vote, that women are equal in terms of university and academic careers and business, in the business world, and in fact in every walk of life, right? We have women prime ministers and women leaders of commerce and women professors and scientists, and we consider that to be completely normal. But you do realize, don't you, that of course in terms of the history of the world, this is nothing to do with Judaism or Jewish life. In terms of the history of the world, this is something completely, a total revolution, something totally and utterly different from the way people lived in Europe even 100 years ago or so. Idea of women, Oxford and Cambridge, I think, only got their first woman, somebody might correct me on this, but it's only in the early 1900s that the first woman student was allowed into Oxford and Cambridge. And even to get a book published, there were no women published authors, right? George Eliot had to call herself George in order to pretend to be a man in order to get her books published. But that's why she took on the name George, because it was to fool in some way, to fool the public into thinking the books are written by a man, because there was no such thing as a woman author, even in England, which was considered to be a civilized country. So you have here something very, very fascinating. The Torah tells us, right, that as a result of the Chet Adam Harishon, as a result of that original spiritual disaster, certain curses came into the world. One of them is the subservience of women, but as the world comes a bit closer to ultimate redemption, that is one of the signs that the curses are being lifted. It's interesting that the other curse for the woman, which is that childbirth will be extremely painful and possibly fatal for women, right, has also been lifted by modern science, right? And and if you look at the numbers, even let's say 100 years ago, of fatalities of women in childbirth, it's unthinkable. I think for women of today, it's unthinkable that they should have to have children and know that they've got like a 40% chance of dying in childbirth. And that idea is unthinkable to us at all. But that was the case throughout almost the entire human history until the 20th century, that childbirth was potentially fatal and there was nothing one could do about it. Women died in childbirth. There were no C-section operations available. There were no blood transfusions available. There was no way to stop the bleeding if there was a problem. The breech births even could be fatal. There were so many different ways in which, God forbid, women died in childbirth, and yet that was part of the curse. And that was part of the curse which followed mankind all the way through from the very beginning until the 20th century. So what we're seeing here, and I think this is a very interesting thought, that the woman is given two curses, and that is the pain and possible fatality of childbirth and the subservience to man. And that curse has been, in the last century, very significantly changed in certain parts of the world. Not in all parts of the world. There are large parts of the world in Africa and in the third world where women do still die in childbirth and where women are still subservient to men. But in the world that we inhabit, in the Western world, these curses have been alleviated, and that is not a bad thing. And that is something which, as I say, was to a certain extent predicted in the Kabbalistic writings of the Torah, that these curses would be alleviated. It's interesting then to compare it a little bit to the curse that was given to Adam Harishon, to the man. What was his curse? Let's have a quick look at the text for a moment. What was said to Adam Harishon when he left Gan Eden? So he was told, Ula Adam Omar, right, can you see this? The man was told, Ki shomata l'kol ishtecha, because you listened to your wife's voice and you ate from the forbidden fruit. Aruro ha'adamo ba'avurecha, the earth will be cursed for you, be'itzavan techlena kol yemeichecha, and you will eat it with be'itzavon, with hard work, with toil, right? And then Pasuk continues, "V'kotes v'darda tatzmiach loch, v'ochalt es esev hasada," right? Thorns and thistles will sprout for you. In other words, the earth will not, if you like, smoothly and automatically provide you with sustenance. And here comes the crucial phrase, "B'zeas apecha tochalech." You will only be able to survive with the sweat of your brow. Right? You will only be able to eat by working hard manual labor your entire life. Now, I think that's also an interesting thought, following what I said before about the curse to the woman. And it could be, one could argue, that also in the 20th century and 21st century, and this curse has been to a certain extent alleviated. That the idea of earning one's livelihood primarily through hard physical labor, which was basically 95% of mankind throughout the whole of human history, were involved in hard physical labor. Everything was hard. Growing your food was hard. Drawing water from the well was hard, right? Sowing, planting, and reaping was hard. Living out in the field under harsh conditions, subject to animals and all sorts of insects and illnesses. All these things were very hard. And that's how 95% of people lived. I say 95%, it's probably more like 98%. There were always 2% of privileged, wealthy people who had slaves and servants and were surrounded by all sorts of domestic stuff. But 95% of mankind didn't live like that. Right? 95% of mankind lived b'zeas apecha, by the sweat of their brow. And really, it's only in the 20th century that actually a large percentage, if you like, of people are able to earn their livelihood without hard manual labor. My guess is that the majority of the people attending this shir have been through their life able to earn their livelihood by sitting at a desk or by engaging in business activities of one sort or another, which did not involve the sweat of their brow and hard physical exertive labor and exposure to the elements and the animal kingdom and having to extract from the ground their livelihood, one vegetable at a time, and having to draw the water from the well one bucketful at a time. That hard physical labor also has been changed in the modern world, and one could view this through the perspective that I mentioned before as also, in a sense, a step in the right direction, coming closer to the days of Mashiach, coming closer to Yemos HaMashiach, if we follow this idea of the Zohar, that as one gets closer to Mashiach, the effects of the curse wear off. And we're no longer, in that sense, doomed either to fatal births or to subservience of women or to hard physical labor. And I think this is a very interesting idea. I think this is an idea which gives us a bit of a new perspective on the biblical origins of mankind and on modern developments and the way in which human beings live today differently to the way they lived for all of world history until the 20th century. There is here an interesting word, an interesting chazal I want to share with you, one of my favorites, and I'm determined to do it today before we end the shir. If you have a look here in this pasuk, when Adam is told, the coats, the dar tatzmiach loch, so he's being told what? He's being told that the earth itself is not going to, if you like, automatically produce fruit trees and all his sustenance automatically out of the earth. It's the earth left to its own devices will produce thorns and weeds and thistles and useless, from your point of view, useless plants, and you're going to have to live with that. And here in this context is an interesting word. This word dar, dalad reish, But coats for dardar. Now the word dardar now the word coats is a well-known word. The word coats means thorns. The word dardar is a very strange word which we've never come across before or since. But there's some very interesting midrashic, symbolic material on this word dardar that I'd like to share with you, and I hope you enjoy it. So let's have a look at this. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a Talmudic trip here for a moment. This is a Gemara in Eruvin Yud Gimel, right? Where the Gemara says as follows. Let's just have a look at a piece of Gemara together. Omer Shmuel, Mishum Rabbi Meir. Okay, so this was said in the name of Rav Meir. Shayisi Lomed Eitz Rabbi Akiva. So Rav Meir is well known to have been a disciple of Rabbi Akiva. Hoyisi Matil Kankamtum Letoch Hadio. What is he talking about here? So this is dio is ink. I'm not going to go into this. He translates it here as iron sulfate. Just to give you a bit of a background here, the question is the type of ink that is used to write a Sefer Torah and to write mezuzahs and tefillin. The question is, what type of ingredients is one allowed to put into that ink? So this is a little bit of an interesting story. So Rav Meir writes as follows: I then went at a certain stage in my life, Rav Meir says, to learn Torah from Rabbi Yishmael, who was a colleague of Rav Meir, of Rabbi Akiva. Omar Li, and he said to me, "V'ni ma malachtecha," which is in itself a bit interesting. Not a question that is often asked in certain circles nowadays. He asked him, "What do you do for a parnasa?" Okay, I'm not sure that every Rosh Kollel asks his students, "What do you do to earn a living?" But Rabbi Yishmael asked Rav Meir, "Ma malachtecha," what do you do to earn a living? That's what he asked. It's very nice that you're sitting here in my Beis HaMedrash learning Torah, but how do you earn a living? Omar Loi, so he said to him, you can follow in the English if you like. Omar Loi, so Rav Meir answers him, Lavlar Ani. Lavlar Ani means I'm a sofer. I earn a living by writing tefillin and mezuzahs and Sefer Torah. And here comes an interesting bit. Omar Li, so he said to me, Beni, that's a term of endearment, my son, hevi zohir b'malachtecha. You know that you have to be extremely zahir, right? Zahir means here, if you like, meticulous. When you're writing a Sefer Torah or mezuzahs or tefillin, you have to be very meticulous on every kutza shel yud, every small detail. Why? He says, Shemalachtecha meleches shomayim. This work of yours, it's true, it's for you, it's a living, but actually it's meleches shomayim, right? It's a heavenly, he translates it as a heavenly service. And then he says a very interesting phrase. Now we're coming to the phrase which I want to focus on a bit more, because he says, Shema ata machase os achas o miyater os achas. Maybe you are going to add in one letter more or detract one letter less out of the word. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen if a sefer leaves a letter out of the word? He writes a word and he forgets to put a letter in there. It's possible, right? The Sefer Torah is possible, or the mezuzah is possible if a letter is missing. But here comes Rabbi Yishmael and says something much more dramatic than that. Nimtzeis machriv es kol ha'olam kul. If you make a mistake, right, in these words, you can destroy the entire world. So what does he mean by that? Why are you destroying the entire world? It's not a I can see here. I didn't bring the whole. I didn't bring the whole Gemara, and of course, the rest of the Gemara is the bit that I was interested in. So I'll just tell it to you Baal Peh. Sorry, when I'm editing and making the text. What's interesting here is that the conversation continues between them, and what happens is that Rabbi Yishmael says to his disciple Rav Meir, he says, look, for example, he says, you could be writing the letter Daled. And everybody knows how the letter Daled is written. It's a simple letter with a right angle top line and then a vertical sideline, right? So he says you could be writing the letter Daled and the ink is still wet, and a fly could land on the top right-hand corner of the Daled, right? And erase just one tiny minuscule part of the top right-hand corner of the Daled. And what will happen? What are you left with if the top right-hand corner of the Daled is slightly erased? You're left with the letter Resh, right? The difference in the Daled and the Resh, are you following me? The difference between the Daled and the Resh is only at the top right-hand corner. The Resh also has one vertical top bar and one horizontal sidebar, but at the top right-hand corner, it's rounded, and the Daled is squared off, right? So the difference between the Resh and the Daled is minuscule, absolutely minuscule, okay? Why is that important? Why is that important? Just 1 second, did I bring it here? I can see I didn't bring what I wanted to bring here. You're going to have to bear with me for a moment. What's interesting here is that the Resh and the Daled in this context have a much deeper meaning to them. We find, for example, in the Sefer Torah, many people are aware that some of the letters in the Sefer Torah are written extra large. One of them is, in this week's Parsha, in Parshas Boischanan, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echod, right? The last letter of Echod is a Daled, right? And that's written in the Sefer Torah extra large. That Daled at the end of Echod is extremely meaningful in lots of ways I won't go into for the moment, but this is, in a sense, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the word Echad itself represents our emunah, our belief, our monotheistic belief in one God is summed up in this word, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Daled, right? If you go to Parshas Kisisa, so Parshas Kisisa in Shemos deals with Moshe Rabbeinu is talking about paganism, and the Torah's warning about paganism. And there the pasuk says, "Lo sishtachave le'el acher," not to daven, not to address another god, right? And the word acher is used frequently in the Torah. Elohim acherim. Elohim acherim is always a reference to pagan gods, right? Acher means something else, in the sense of something wrong, something negative. It's something else. The word acher is actually quite a powerful word in its own right. Acher just means another one, right? But el acher in this context is something, and in that word, lo sishtachve el acher, the resh of acher is a big resh. It's a massive, it's much bigger, it's twice the size of all the other letters in the Sefer Torah. So you have the big Daled represents emunah, and the big resh represents the loss of emunah. It's the difference between Hashem Echad and Lahavdil Elohim Acherim is symbolized by the Daled and the Resh. And what's going on here is something very, very fascinating. That the Daled, the word Echad and the word Acher are spelt almost the same. Echad is Aleph Chet Daled, and Acher is Aleph Chet Resh. So the Aleph and the Chet are exactly the same. And the Daled and the Resh are also almost exactly the same, except for what? Except for the top right-hand corner. The top right-hand corner is the difference between Hashem Echad and Lahavdil Elohim Achirim, Eil Acher. Right? So in a sense, the Daled and the Resh represent the presence of Emunah and the loss of Emunah. Are you following me? And that's what Rabbi Yishmael meant when he said to Rav Meir, you've got to be careful, because if you are not careful when you're writing and the top right-hand corner of the Daled becomes rounded, he doesn't just say to him, it's not just that it'll be apostle Sefer Torah, it's atamachriv es ha'olam. You will destroy the world. Because by losing that top right-hand corner of the Daled, you are transforming a world of emunah into a world without emunah. Okay, so that is really that Gemara there. Let's come back to our pasuk here in the closing minutes of the Shia. So if you have a look at this pasuk, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that God says to Adam Arishan, you know what's going to happen to you when you leave Gan Eden. He says, "V'kotes v'dardar tatzmiach lach." So dardar is written dalad reish, right? And the meaning of this is, so I saw this in the Bnei Yisachar and in other writings of the Gedolei Hasidus, but the word darda means confusion in the world of emunah, because the dalad is the emunah and the reish is the loss of emunah. So dalad reish means a world in which our belief in God and our sense that God is, that we're living in God's world, comes and goes. It's sometimes dalad, sometimes reish, sometimes dalad, sometimes reish. You won't have anymore a constant shivisi Hashem l'negdi tamid, a constant sense of the presence of God. You will be living in a world of dardar, right? And dardar means the dalad and the reish are going to be confused with each other. And sometimes people will have the dalad, and sometimes they'll lose it. And the difference in the dalad and the reish is a hair's breadth. There's the difference. And that is really all in this word v'dardar. And it's interesting, again, I'm not going to, one last reference to this is that when the Torah then speaks to us about Amalek, Amalek is the antithesis of Klal Yisrael. And Chazal tell us that the goal of Amalek is to erase out of this world any trace of Emunah. So here again, you will find in Parshas Beshalach, when it speaks about Amalek, right? So it says, "Vayom Hashem kimach emcha zeicha Amalek," right? This is the end of Beshalach. So what is it? What is the very, very last word that the Torah says in Parshas Beshalach about Amalek? He says, "Ki yod al keiska milchama laHashem ba'Amalek." There is a constant in every generation, midar dar. There is a battle against Amalek, midar dar. And look at the way it's written in the Torah, dar dar. It's uncharacteristically written without the vav. It's written dalad reish, dalad reish. Can you see that? That what it's saying that the battle against Amalek is in every generation, but the word dar is spelled dalad vav reish. But here, in the context of Amalek, it says, you know what the battle with Amalek is? The battle with Amalek is dar, dar. And that is the dar dar that we saw before with Adam, with Adam as he leaves Gan Eden. Gan Eden is a world of pure, clear emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Leaving Gan Eden, we enter the world that we are familiar with, where emunah is sometimes there and sometimes lacking. It's a world of dar dar. And that is the power of Amalek, to exploit the confusion of emunah and to be, right, in our generation, we've also seen like militant atheists writing books, trying to convince the world that there is no emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, chas v'shalom. But this is somehow the code word in the Torah is dalad reish, dalad reish. Nechama Hashem ba'Amalek midar dar. This is a reference to the dar of Adam and Chava, and part of the post-Gan Eden world. The post-Gan Eden world, which is which we are living in. That's all we have time for today, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed this. It's always nice to see you all, and just a few reflections on the consequences of Eitz Hadas and how in the last 100 years many of the curses given to Adam and Eve have been weakened